to spark conversations, just as soon as I get the voice, lead confidently, and change the narrative of their leadership. Ms. Rossi has also served in leadership roles with Innovative Changes and the I Have a Dream Foundation. She currently sits on the boards of the Oregon State Bar, Kairos PDX, and United Way. Please join me in welcoming Tracy Rossi and Governor Kate Brown.
Good afternoon. Before we jump in, I just want to thank the City Club for hosting this forum for the governor and I to have this conversation. I also want to take a moment to thank the North Clackamas Civic Scholars that we had an opportunity to meet with before our conversation. There you are. Great job. Had wonderful questions, and I look forward to hearing from you all later with additional questions. So as Lisa mentioned, we are going to chat a little bit today, follow up with Governor about her State of the State address that she gave a few months ago, and talk a little bit about her initiatives that she outlined there, and also talk a little bit about what's changed during that time. And we will also dive into some more priorities that are coming up, and we'll talk about that special session next week. I'll just do a quick little summary of what my takeaways were from the State of the State, and really looking at the Future Ready Oregon as an initiative to close the gap between the workforce that we currently have and the workforce that we need in the future. And want to really hear from you about some of the steps we can take as a state to make sure that we can close some of those gaps. Also embedded in that is how that impacts or can impact our high school graduation rate. There are a lot of great statistics around how having the technical education really improves the graduation rate. So we can talk a little bit about that and who that might serve, and who also, where there might also be some opportunities to serve students who are underrepresented. And also we can talk a little bit about how much that might cost in the budget implications. So we'd love for you, Governor, to bring us up to date and share some additional highlights of your State of the State. Thank you.
Again, we are not immune. At Lebanon High School, a student was brandishing a gun. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but our students must be safe on our K through 12 campuses, on our university campuses, on our community colleges, in our homes and in our churches, and our imperative that we gap. And as I travel around the state, one of the things that I hear from businesses, frankly, in every single corner of the state, is that they're really challenged to hire the workforce that they need. And that's where Future Ready comes in. What I call Future Ready is that the goal is to close the workforce gap between the workforce that we have and the workforce that we need to fuel the economy of Oregon's future. And I like to think of it, I'm a skier, I like to think of it as two tracks. One track is the career side, folks who are, generally speaking, done with their education. They may be working at a job, low pay, they may be a displaced worker, and they really feel they're ready for a new opportunity. And it looks like programs called Apprentee, what I call the Next Gen Apprenticeship programs. And we have 2 new Apprentee programs now in Oregon, one in Bend and one in Eugene. They're training folks in the technology industry, software development. The programs last anywhere from 8 weeks to a year, and folks can come out of that program earning a really solid salary. The other side of the track is the educational side. And for me, it looks like making sure that every single student in Oregon has access to hands-on learning. And we've been able to substantially increase our capacity with the help of voters in ballot measure 98. We invested over $170 million this past biennium in hands-on learning. I want to move that to $300 million so that we can do it for every student in every community. Why is this important? Number one, it will substantially increase our high school graduation rate. The career and technical ed programs that I've toured, and I've toured several all around the state, one in Salem, the CTE Center, their graduation rate is 98%. So we know this can have an incredible impact on our graduation rate. More importantly, it keeps students in school because they want to be there. It makes education relevant. It connects the classroom to the careers. And at the same time, we're creating a skilled and diverse workforce. So that's the kind of work we're doing around Future Ready Oregon. We've passed legislation. We're partnering with the private sector around housing to make sure that we have the housing available, and we're moving forward on this initiative.
Great, thank you, Governor. I'm going to do a mention for our radio audience. This is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Tracy Rossi, Executive Director at the Center for Women's Leadership, and I'm here today with Governor Kate Brown. So you talked a little bit about addressing the high school education and our still fairly dismal high school graduation rate. We're still in the bottom 5, unfortunately. Governor, I'd love you to talk a little bit about some of the underserved and underrepresented students in our school system and how policies that you have in mind will impact them moving forward.
So our graduation rate, as you noted, is one of the lowest in the country. We need to change that. It's absolutely unacceptable. In the last 5 years, the graduation rate has, actually in the last 3 years, the graduation rate has increased almost 5 percentage points. And in terms of students of color, we're seeing anywhere from 5 to 7 point percentage increase. And that's come about for a couple of reasons. We've made significant targeted investments in underserved communities, African American, Latino, American Indian communities. At the same time, we've moved forward on legislation. I'm very proud to sign into law Senate Bill 13. It requires that Oregon Indian curriculum be taught in every single school around the state. It's culturally competent. And we also were able to sign ethnic studies legislation as well. So I think these are the types of policies that will specifically support and target our underserved communities around the entire state of Oregon.
Great, thank you. So I want to transition a little bit and talk about leadership, specifically women in leadership, and love to hear your thoughts about where we are right now in this country in terms of women in leadership, in the workforce, in politics, and if you have a personal story that you might share to help elucidate this point.
I have a lot of personal stories. I'll only share one. Tracy, thank you for your leadership at the center. I miss being on the board there, but I love the opportunity to grow women's leadership at the college level, and I hope at some point in time I can come back on the board and help you out. So we absolutely need more women and people of color in leadership roles across this country. I truly believe that public policies that are made when there is a diversity of voices at the table are more reflective, they're more respectful, and they're more resilient. And I like to say to folks, if you're not at the leadership table, then you're on the menu. And I think women have been on the menu for a really long time. People of color have been on the menu for a really long time. Folks in the LGBT community have been on the menu for a very long time. And no more. Time's up, and we're going to keep moving forward. I am so excited about the number of women running for Congress in this state. I am so excited about the number of women running for governor's offices. There are 6 women governors across the country. And when my spouse is here, hi Dan Little, when Dan and I went to the White House last year to have dinner with the Trump administration, President Trump welcomed the governors, the first ladies, and their daughters, not even recognizing the experiences of many of us in the room. So that was a wake-up call for me. I've certainly had other experiences in my life, but it's time for change, and I know that all of us working together can make it happen, not just here in Oregon, but across the entire country.
Thank you. We also, of course, have the Me Too movement that we're still on the heels of. And I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about how some of your policies specifically have helped to mitigate the culture of misogyny and sexism in the workplace?
So, as a young lawyer, I had the experience of being treated differently because of my gender and because of my sexual orientation. And so I am absolutely committed to a workplace that is fair and safe for all. I have sent out emails to my 40,000 state employees to let them know that sexual harassment, that gender discrimination, that racial discrimination is absolutely inappropriate and unacceptable, and particularly for folks who feel like they're being harassed, making sure they have safe places to report and let folks know what's happening. We are working within state agencies, across state agencies to make sure that we have consistent reporting and responding practices. The entire governor's team went to the legislature's sexual harassment training, and we're certainly collaborating in efforts of the Oregon Law Commission to take a look at the capital sexual harassment policies. It is absolutely unacceptable. It must change, and we're working on it.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to transition here a little bit. I'm a little bit of a policy wonk, so we're going to roll up our sleeves and get into the weeds here. Let's talk a little bit about some of your policies and priorities. And let's start by looking at the economic front. Earlier, I referenced the special session that you called for starting on Monday. And if you could just chat a little bit with us about this business tax and describe to us what it is, the expansion of the tax loophole, and who this is going to benefit and how this relates to the Trump tax.
Wow, okay. As you all know, the feds passed a tax plan early mid-December, and we spent the next several weeks studying the implications of for Oregon. As a result of the Trump tax plan, the legislature made a decision to pass legislation to essentially disconnect. I don't want to go too far into the weeds in Senate Bill 1528, but essentially in Oregon, we have a special tax rate for pass-through entities, limited liability companies, S-corps, and partnerships. In the federal tax plan, they essentially copied that and provided a special tax deduction for those same pass-through entities, as well as sole proprietorships. Oregon is only one of 5 or 6 states that had this special tax rate. So I made a decision, somewhat difficult decision, to sign 1528. And the reason that I did that, number one, because the state, in terms of our budget, we would really struggle to cut an additional $248 million out of this year's budget. It would impact primarily schools, education, public safety, and human services. And the other piece is that Oregon filers will still be able to receive their preferred tax treatment on their Oregon taxes, and for the Oregon filers that comply with the criteria of the federal tax law, they can also get that special tax treatment on their federal taxes. What they won't be able to do is leverage that into a third tax break. So that's why I made the decision to sign Senate Bill 1528. But for me in that process, what became very clear is that there was a segment of Oregon's businesses, our smallest of our small, our sole proprietors, our mom and pops, that didn't get access, at least under the Oregon system, to that preferential tax treatment. So I've asked the legislature to add sole proprietorships, our moms and our pops, to that preferred treatment. It's certainly under conversation right now. There are certainly folks on one side who say it's too expensive, we can't afford it. And there are other folks who are saying it should be bigger if we really want to help small businesses. So I'm hoping I'm in the oatmeal place of just about right, and not too hot and not too cold.
Great, thank you. You talked about the challenges around the budget. We all understand that underlying much of that is our complicated relationship with PERS in the state. The next legislative session is going to be tough because of PERS. And in your State of the State speech, you said that we must make the PERS system more sustainable and keep the debt we owe from hobbling public education. How will you do that?
Great question. So my focus has been in terms of 3 parts. Number one, we took action in the 2017 legislative session to increase the number of staff at the Department of Treasury. We did that, the number of investors in-house. We did that because we know over a 20-year history that our in-house folks have a better rate of return than the private sectors. And we want to make sure that we're getting the best rate of return on our investments in PERS, because that will help drive down employer rates and eventually ensure that more money is going in the classroom. The second piece is through the leadership of my office, we created the PERS Unfunded Actuarial Liability Task Force. And we had some brilliant folks take a look at and come up with numerous recommendations about how we tackle this $21–22 billion unfunded actuarial liability. And the challenge is there are over 750 jurisdictions that participate in that. I can only control the state the state side. I can't control the city of Eugene or Marion County and their debt liability. So 2 of the recommendations in the report were proposed as legislation. We've passed them, and we're currently implementing them. As simple as I can get it, number 1, we created an employer incentive fund, the goal of which 4-to-1 match for local jurisdictions to start paying down their PERS UAL by investing in side accounts. Just as an example, hypothetically, if there were to be a case that gets resolved and resources go to local jurisdictions, it would be an incredible opportunity for them to invest in their side accounts, pay down their UAL with those unanticipated revenues. Second side, and actually we know that it's already working because we've seen some local jurisdictions, including Ontario, Oregon, already taking action. Second side is K through 12, and what we are doing is essentially capturing unexpected, unanticipated revenues to invest in side accounts for schools. The goal, again, to reduce employer rates. The third piece is employee skin in the game. And for me, that looks twofold. Number 1, I've asked, and state employees responded by picking up their 6%. About 98% of state employees are now doing that. The second piece is what I call skin in the game. And there was legislation introduced in 2017 to do this. But essentially, public employees would bear the risks of the market. So I think for me, Tracy, as essentially the state CEO, my challenge is that I have to attract the best and the brightest public employees. I think that's absolutely critical in terms of the types of services we are offering. And to do that, I have to have a compensation package that's competitive with the private market. And right now, our market survey shows us we're about 103%. I know we're working with some folks in the business community who dispute that analysis, but I think we can agree upon the numbers there. And PERS, our retirement system, our health care benefits, and our salary, I can't negotiate just on one of those. There has to be an entire package, and that package has to be competitive. And so that's the view I'm bringing as we move forward.
Okay, having said that, so we know what some of the compromises are. What does success look like?
The success looks like a sustainable system, and we can do that. I believe that the OPSERT system, we're now on a 3rd tier. We have Tier 1 employees, we have Tier 2 employees, and we have a 3rd tier OPSERPs, which was created in 2003. It's commensurate with about 20 other states across the country. And at least the fiscal analysts say it's a sustainable system. Most of the debt that I talked about, the unfunded actuarial liability, is driven by Tier 1 and Tier 2 employed retirees.
Great, thank you very much. Let's transition into talk a little bit about clean energy. There's been a lot of conversation around the Clean Energy Job Initiative, which will be a big part of next session's work. Can you describe Clean Energy Jobs, the initiative for us, and share your perspective on the impact on our economy?
So I am absolutely adamant that Oregon continues to play a leading role across this country in tackling global climate change. I know we're a small state, And I also know we're probably a very small part of the global climate challenge, but I believe very strongly that we need to continue the progress and we need to be leaders for the rest of the country. Since I became governor, we've taken numerous steps to tackle greenhouse gas emissions. I signed into law a low carbon fuel standard, reducing the carbon intensity of our fuels. We moved forward, and actually we were the first state in the entire country to intentionally move away from coal-generated electricity and doubling our renewable portfolio. That's a really good thing, you guys. Yes. I was also really pleased that we were able to bring Republicans and Democrats together, urban and rural Oregonians, to pass a transportation package. And it's the most comprehensive transportation package that Oregon has ever seen. Just a couple of highlights. In addition to creating over 16,000 jobs, the legislation requires that we invest statewide in public transit, and I think that's absolutely critical. Every community across the state of Oregon was asking for transit. Now we all have to use it, you guys. The second piece was we invested in electric vehicle rebates for low and moderate income families. It's under legal challenge, but I'm hoping we're going to be successful. So these are the kind of tools that we invested in with our transportation package. And here's the harsh reality. We cannot meet our greenhouse gas emission goals, our reduction goals, without looking at a carbon pricing framework. And so I have chosen to move forward with the framework, the Clean Energy Jobs Framework, because I believe it is a market-based approach that will allow businesses to use the least cost approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We couldn't get it done in February, but what we were able to do, we were able to make lemonade out of lemons. We were able to get the creation and funding for a carbon policy office. Kristen Sheeran from Climate Solutions is leading that work, and we're working collaboratively with the legislature to be able to move forward in the 2019 session on this issue. There are a couple of priorities that are critically important for me. One, I want to make sure we're continuing to grow the economy and at the same time making sure we're actually reducing carbon emissions. Secondly, I want to make sure we're not exacerbating already existing economic disparities in our underserved communities. And so what that looks like, we're still working on that, but that is critically important for me. And the third piece is I want to make sure it makes sense in terms of what's happening in the region. And so Governor Inslee and I have a lot of competition going on in a number of issues. They have a carbon pricing initiative that's likely to be on the ballot in November. I want to make sure that whatever we do here is integrating into what's happening in the region. So that's my goals.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question, but I'm going to make a broadcast mention for our radio audience. This is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Tracy Rossi, Executive Director at the Center for Women's Leadership, and I'm here today with Governor Kate Brown. My follow-up question on the Clean Energy Act, just to help put it in context, because I find these to be complex issues. Who is for on the side of pro, and what are some of the arguments against it?
Who is for? A variety of organizations, environmental organizations. We've had communities of color. We've had the tribes. A number of the tribes are at the table and very supportive. And the reason we're seeing these groups in particular, tribes in particular, is that they are most hardest hit by the changing climate conditions. And we're seeing that in terms of fire, in terms of impact on first foods, on salmon. And so we're seeing a broad array of communities coming to the table. I know that there are some business organizations that are supportive. And who's opposed? I think I'm hearing primarily from communities in rural Oregon that they're concerned, and their concerns are legitimate. We just passed a transportation package to increase the costs of gas to pay for our roads and bridges and seismic resiliency. And they're concerned that further increases in transportation costs will either price them out of the market or make it even more difficult and more challenging to live in rural Oregon. So we've got to address those issues as we move forward.
Thank you. Okay, we'll transition. I wanted to just bring up one issue that's a national issue and a local issue is the opioid crisis, and would love to hear from you how it's being addressed in Oregon in relationship to how it's also being addressed nationally.
So one of the challenges is that we are seeing about one Oregonian die every other day from the opioid crisis in Oregon. And what I feel good about is that there's a very large coalition of folks working together to tackle this crisis. We put together an opioid task force last year, and we were able to pass legislation to give us more tools to fight the opioid crisis. At the same token, worked very closely with Representative Tana Sanchez to pass legislation to, I'll say, reinvigorate our Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission, and want to say thank you to Dr. Richardson for his willingness to take the leadership helm there. Their task is challenging to develop a comprehensive strategic plan around substance and alcohol treatment in Oregon in a relatively short period of time. But we must do this. We must tackle this crisis. I've seen on the East Coast, they are seeing substantially more deaths from the opioid crisis per capita than we are. And so if we don't get ahead of it, it's going to really have devastating consequences for Oregon. But what I do know is this: we all have family or friends, relatives, business colleagues that have been impacted by substance abuse and alcohol abuse. And we must have a system, a comprehensive system in Oregon that works. And it's been an incredible experience for me to recently meet a number of the parents in recovery. I toured a program in Eugene a couple weeks ago, and this particular program allows both moms to have their children with them in the recovery process, but also dads. And there's very few of these programs across the country. I think it's one of 3 that allow dads to have their children in the recovery process with them. Treatment works. We know it. We know that different treatment people have different treatment needs, but we can do this, and we must do this.
Thank you. I want to talk about healthcare. And Oregonians are interested in affordable, accessible healthcare options. What are the implications of the reduction in federal funding, and how will Oregon fund its health plan and Medicaid moving forward?
Well, we were able to come together, folks from urban Oregon, rural Oregon, Republicans, Democrats, to sustain funding for our Oregon health plan. And I was very pleased to see voters and communities around the state vote yes on ballot measure 101 and sustain that funding. Yay. So those of you living in Multnomah County, this might be a surprise, but ballot measure 101 would have passed without the voters in Multnomah County, and that's a really good thing. That means that health care is important to everyone around the state. I know it passed in Hood River, and it passed in Deschutes County, and it even passed in Curry County, which is great. But what that tells me is that Oregonians very much want to have access to health care for their neighbors, for struggling children, that everyone wants to have access. Right now, adults, we have about 95% of adults have coverage. And in terms of children, we have about 98% of children. With the work that your legislature did, and I did as well, we were able to pass Cover All Kids to provide 100% coverage for our children, ensuring that every child, regardless of their immigration status, is covered. So it's really great. Moving forward, we have a little budget gap for next biennium, and Tina Edlin is taking the helm of coordinating and collaborating with the provider community. We're hoping to come up with a package or a menu of options to provide sustained funding for the Oregon Health Plan, not just for this biennium, but for the next 4 to 6 years. It's a tall order. I don't know that it's been done before, but I think it will give us an opportunity, if we can do this, to stabilize the system, focus on social determinants of health, make sure that all of our folks on the Oregon Health Plan have access to primary care. We know that what we are doing is working. We've saved, in the last handful of years, over $2 billion, and we're keeping the cost growth down, the rate down to 3.4%. We're seeing results that everyone across the country is envious about, and most importantly, we're providing access to Oregonians with good quality health care, and it's also creating jobs around the state. So that's a good thing.
Great, thank you. Let's talk now about Oregon's foster care system, and would really love to hear how you envision shoring that up and ensuring that our most vulnerable children are safe, loved, and supported.
So, Tracy, I think you know that I'm a lawyer, and I used to represent children and parents in the foster care system. I know how challenging it is to turn this system around, and there's no one who's more frustrated than I am at our ability, in our lack of ability to keep our most vulnerable children safe. I have tasked Fairbours and Marilyn Jones with leading this agency. They are focused on the safety of our children in the foster care system, making sure we can reduce caseloads safely for our caseworkers. We have 1.5 times the number of children in our foster care system, and also making sure that we can retain and recruit foster parents, and that we can provide them and the foster children with the support and the services that they need. I'm focused on what I'm calling right-sizing the system, making sure that we are tackling the root causes. So we know that the reason why we have children coming into the foster care system, talked about the opioid crisis, I would just say substance and alcohol abuse more generally. About 60% of the children in our foster care system have a parent or 2 parents that are impacted by substance and alcohol abuse. So that's one area we've been focusing on. The second piece, obviously, is the housing issue. And about 15 to 20% of the families in the foster care system are there due to housing instability and the housing crisis. So I'm happy to tackle that one in a more detailed question later, but we are really focused on how we can build more affordable units and ensure that all of our families have access to safe and stable housing, and particularly our children. And then the third piece is domestic violence, and I've been working on this issue for a number of years. I will tell you that we literally have not changed the dynamic in 20 years in terms of the number of survivors that we are able to help. When I first started in the legislature, we were turning away about 4 out of 5 families, women in their families. The numbers are the same, and I know that the housing crisis is driving that as well. So we're really focused on tackling the root causes and the things that are driving the number of children coming into our system, but our vulnerable children must be safe.
Thank you. And before we wrap up this portion, so we've talked about your vision, we've talked about leadership, we've delved into a myriad of issues that Oregon is facing. Putting all those pieces together, what do you want your legacy to be for the state of Oregon as our governor?
I'll be really short on this one. I was a campfire girl. I was taught that you have to leave the campsite in better shape than you found it, and I want to make sure that Oregon is in better shape than when I retire as governor.
Thank you, Governor. Okay. So we're going to transition into questions. We'll go to the audience. So everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on an index card, please hold it high for staff to collect. You can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. To City Club members who would like to ask a question at the microphone, please identify yourself as a member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less. And I believe we're going to invite our civic scholars to join us first at the podium to answer questions. Thank you.
All right, my name is Dominic Davis. I'm a civic scholar with Clackamas School District. Troy recently said he would send the National Guard to the border. In response, you promised to keep the Oregon National Guard in the state and refuse Trump's order should he give it. Do you plan to uphold this promise?
I am not willing to send our National Guards men and women to the border when there's been absolutely no consultation and collaboration with the states. We relied on over 700 National Guards men and women during the fire season last year. They're critically important for our firefighting efforts, and I am not willing to let them be political pawns in his game of chaos and incompetence.
What do you want to do this next year to support the Me Too movement and women's rights?
Well, I'm certainly going to speak out and help women candidates around the state as much as I can, and certainly around the country. As I mentioned, there's only 6 women governors. You probably know I'm a Democrat. There's only 2 Democratic women governors, and I'd love to be helping some more of my colleagues serve in leadership roles. We know that when women are in leadership roles that the agenda changes. We also know that women's leadership styles are often considered not leading by the dominant culture. And so that's why it's so critically important that we have more women's voices at the table.
My name is Promise King. Governor Brown, you inherited an education system that hasn't worked for a long time. Why do you think the system has been so impervious to innovations and solutions?
Thank you, Promise. I'm going to answer your question a bit more broadly and talk about the work we're doing around equity and inclusion at the state. And I want to share a metaphor. I think a lot of times we build programs, we make the cake, and then we figure out how we make sure we are meeting the needs of diverse and underrepresented communities. Sometimes that's considered the frosting on the cake. Over time, as I've talked to my team, we've talked about this really, if we really want to make sure we're meeting the needs of underserved communities, the flour, it needs to be the flour of the cake, right? Yes. And now I'm actually looking at it differently as a result of conversations I've had and work I'm doing. We probably need to be changing the recipes. And whether it's in our foster care system or in our educational system, an education system that may have worked for the dominant culture is not working for underserved communities. And we're going to have to figure out how we change the recipes and make sure that the services and the programs we are providing, not only that we're meeting the needs, but those communities are at the table helping us deliver and design those programs.
Amen.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Harris. I am a City Club member. My question in 30 seconds or less. Governor, I applaud your past robustness in denouncing negative behaviors and mindsets of those who tend to harm African Americans or people of color, underserved and underrepresented in a physical or verbal manner. In the fourth quarter of 2017, the highest executive level of Multnomah County called in a woman of color the B word. And I do understand that her husband is your chief of staff, but I never heard any comments or denouncements or any conversation where you addressed that issue, whereas you have done that in previous situations, because that is a harmful, and it's like a dangerous word. Why did you never address or denounce that?
I think, Deborah, I've worked really hard to denounce when folks are making hateful and appalling comments about women and people of color. I've worked really hard to respond to that. I will tell you that most recently, and this is just so appalling, the president spoke about immigrants and gang members.
I'm referring to the president. I'm referring to right here locally, Multnomah County.
So all I'll say is I work really hard to denounce. I don't think that helps us create what I call a beloved community. My work as governor, I've really tried hard to send the message that I want all of Oregon to be a welcoming and inclusive place for everyone who chooses to call Oregon home.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. This is a subset of the education question. A couple of years ago, you talked about strengthening the GED so that it was a real diploma. Could you give us a status of that effort, please?
Yes, and I believe in 2014, new testing system came in for GED program that is a stronger testing system. Where we have struggled, from my perspective, is making sure that we have dedicated funding, particularly at the community college level, for adult basic education and adult basic skills. Here's the reality. 30 years in Oregon, if you dropped out of high school, you could get a good paying job in the farming industry or in fishing or in forestry. Those jobs are few and far between. There are good paying jobs for folks who don't want to go to college, and that's why I'm so committed to the work we're doing around Future Ready Oregon and building career pathways so that folks who choose not to complete high school or go on to college have career opportunities that allow them to get a good paying job and be able to support their families and save for retirement.
I'm going to read a question that we received on a card here. So a large earthquake is overdue. Portland bridges over the Willamette are at risk, and unreinforced brick buildings are also in peril. What is the state doing about that here at the Capitol and elsewhere in Oregon?
So we brought on a new Chief Resiliency Office, Mike Harriman, who's coordinating our work at the state level and coordinating our efforts with the Office of Emergency Management, Andrew Phelps. Two areas where we've been focusing at the state level is investing in making sure that our schools are seismically fit or retrofitted. I think we've invested roughly $200 to $300 million in bonding to make that happen. One of the guiding forces for me behind the transportation package was ensuring seismic resiliency for our roads and bridges. There are about 135 bridges on the coast. Essentially, under a 9.0 earthquake, about 100 of them are basically toast. So I can't tell you that the transportation package will fund seismic retrofitting for all of them, but that is work that we have started to do and have to keep doing. And then the other piece is focusing on partnerships between state, local, county, and city, and individuals. And I'm not going to ask you all to raise your hands, but I would love to see at some point a City Club audience where everyone can raise their hand and say they have their 2 weeks worth of preparedness ready. And that means, that's why I didn't ask to raise hands, that means 1 gallon of water per person for 2 weeks. And it also means having your fabulous non-perishables like, I know everybody's favorite, Spam and peanut butter available for 2 weeks. So next time I come back, I'm going to ask for a show of hands, Tracy.
Okay.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Governor, first of all, congratulations on getting the transportation package passed. I happen to know from personal experience that's a difficult and thankless task.
Thank you, Steve Novick.
My question is, we have a horribly inequitable property tax system where the taxes you pay are based largely on what your house was worth in 1995 rather than what it is worth today. That means that people in recently gentrified areas like Inner East Portland are paying extremely low property taxes, whereas people in ungentrified areas like Far East Portland are paying relatively high property taxes. Are you planning to work with Senator Hass in 2019 to craft a measure to send to the voters to address this inequity?
Yes. I have to say, I think we've got to do some education with voters around the state, and I think our first priority should be around residential and commercial property, but would love to have the ongoing property tax conversation in the state again.
Governor, I'm Ellen Lowe, 87-year-old city.
Okay, you guys,
member.
let's give her a round of applause. Thank you, Ellen.
Our paths first crossed back before you were in public life, but you really were in public life as an attorney for children. And what impressed me the most was that unlike so many attorneys, you asked questions seeking information, not thinking that you had the answer already. I think that in the PERS area, you have been doing a remarkable job of bringing people together to help us work through a process that some of us in this room actually remember when it first started. What I'm asking you today is to look for researchers in Oregon, some historians, to put together a piece that would be understandable for 6th graders, for 87-year-olds, that would trace how we got where we are, what the remedies have been, what the results of some of those have been, particularly in the courts, because I keep hearing people say, oh, the PERS problem. But before we can proceed with what you are putting together, I think more of us need to understand how we got there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. And thank you, Ellen, for your incredible leadership in this state. It was truly an honor to be able to work and stand shoulder to shoulder with you in the Capitol, and it's just really good to see you here today. I will tell you that we do have a presentation. We were going to offer it up. I'm not going to, well, I suppose I can offer my Chief of Staff up for the next City Club meeting. It might need some work in terms of the history, but I do think it's really important for folks to have a better understanding of the system and how we got here. So I probably should also say I am responding yes to your question then, so thank you.
Thank you.
Kurt Wabering, member. Oregon is one of only 2 states in the country, the other is Louisiana, that doesn't require unanimity in a felony jury trial. And my question, a genuine question, is would this make a difference, and if so, a positive difference, to change this?
I actually believe it would make a difference. I don't think we look at Louisiana as the bastion of progressivism in this country. And we in Oregon have a very long and very tortured history of racism in our criminal justice system. And honestly, it's not that long ago. I saw the MacArthur Foundation report that came out a couple of years ago showing that right here in Multnomah County, African Americans, Latinos see very disturbing results in our criminal justice system. So not only do I believe that we need to change the jury system, and I know that the majority leader in the House, Representative Jennifer Williamson, is taking the lead on that. There's a lot more we can do in terms of tackling the issues of fairness and justice in our criminal justice system. I'll just name a couple of quick things. Number one, last session we passed legislation tackling racial profiling and specifically reducing penalties for possession of a controlled substance from a felony to a misdemeanor because we knew the impacts on African American and Latino men. I am working very hard to diversify the judicial branch of our government, and as you probably know, appointed the first African American to ever serve on the Oregon Supreme Court. So there is so much work that we need to do to make sure that our criminal justice system, our justice system, is truly fair and just for all.
Thank you, Governor, and that was our last question. So
that was?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was.
Oh, I was like,
thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, our time is up for today, and we need to pause the discussion for now. But we hope this is the beginning of even more in-depth conversations for all of you. Please join me in thanking our panel for being here today, and also thanking Deanna D'Souza for producing today's program. We appreciate all of your work. Thank you.